Well, welcome to Keys of the Kingdom. I'm Brother Gregory, and again, we're going to talk about the Kingdom of God because that's what Christ came to preach, was that the Kingdom of God was at hand. It was within your reach. It was not for the dead, but for the living. He was going to take the kingdom away from the Pharisees and the Sadducees and those people who were sitting in the seats of Moses, and appoint it to another group that he was going to call out to be ministers of that kingdom. And that sounds like, wait a minute. You mean Jesus was appointing people to rule over us? No, because he forbid them to rule over you, because that's not what the kingdom of God is all about. Remember, the only reason they had a king is because they rejected God. This was another original sin, just like Adam and Eve rejected what God was telling them, which was, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, eat of the tree of life. What is that? This tree thing, it's a metaphor, and it's told to us in an allegory of Adam and Eve. Now, maybe there was a real tree, but clearly there's a message in the story. The same as there was a message with Cain and Abel. And Abel was doing something with sheep. I don't know what that was all about, right? And Cain was doing something with vegetables and stuff that he grew in the garden. And they had a conflict, and Abel got his head bashed in by Cain. Well, that's the story, and that's a great story. What does it all mean? And there are a lot of people out there trying to figure out what it means and then there are people telling you that, no, there was a literal tree and a literal snake and a literal 7 days. And, well, I'm okay with that. But if you don't get the meaning, the message of the story, it doesn't really matter whether it was 7 days or 7,000 years or 70,000 years or whatever. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you can go into in the Old Testament and look at. And why does he say replenish the earth? Was there people here and then they disappeared, and then because of some giant catastrophe, and then they had to replenish the earth? I mean, we don't actually have a radio clock there in the Bible that's saying, and now we do this. Now you'll find discrepancies if you go to it taking everything absolutely literal. But that's what people do, is they unmoor the metaphor from the message, and they never get the message. They're over there arguing about, 7 days or 7,000 years, a day is 1,000 years, and all this stuff, and they're back and forth. And they don't get the simplicity of the message. You're supposed to love God, which is some sort of heuristic form of or source of life, the creator, we call him, that this divine planner that has put so much abundance of life on this planet, and you can go up to Arctic or down to the Antarctic, and you find microbes living in solid ice, surviving, and you can find microbes living at volcano vents that are actually almost a silicon base instead of a carbon base life form. So you find all this life everywhere you go, struggling to exist and to reproduce and to exist and to reproduce and die and reproduce and exist. And this has gone on for quite a while now. And you don't think there's a designer involved in all this? So whatever that designer is, this thing we call God, the Creator, you're supposed to love that life-generating entity, reality, source of the universe. And you're supposed to love one another. That's it. That's the kingdom right there in the basics of the kingdom. If you do those two things, everything's going to work out okay. As much as things can work out okay. Okay with what? Okay with what you want, okay with the universe. You'll be right with the universe. But what does that look like? How does that translate? what were all these parables about that Christ was telling us? And why did he take the kingdom away? Why weren't they bearing fruit? You know, I mean, why did he say they were not bearing fruit, and so he was going to take the kingdom away? Well, he gave us a number of things. They weren't attending daily to a administration of charity. They were operating by force. This was John the Baptist. He was going to do it by charity. Everybody else was going to do it by force. And they were going to provide social welfare by charity. You know, maybe Bernie should try that. You know, Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is a Democratic Socialist. And we're going to talk a lot about structure of government because the church is one form of government. But, you know, when I say the word church, you don't get what I mean probably. Most people out there in the world who are of the world don't get what I mean. They think, you know, we went to church. We had church service. We, you know, church was really great today. Well, the word church means called out. So the called out were really great today. You know, because the word church comes from the word ecclesia, which means the called out. So I went to the called out. I mean, if we started putting that word, the words called out there, instead of every time we use the word church, we put the called out. Who are we talking about? Who's called out? Well, it was the called out ministers that Jesus appointed to serve the kingdom, serve the people as the kingdom. Because he says, I'm going to take the kingdom away. I'm going to appoint it to my little flock. I'm not going to appoint it to everybody. I'm just going to appoint it to my little flock. And my little flock is to minister to the people in a system of charity, through faith, hope, and charity, instead of force, fear, and violence, which is the way all the other governments were doing it. So now you think you went to church last week, but you also went to the guys who use force, fear, and violence to take care of the needy of your society. That's what Bernie does. He uses violence. He uses force. He uses the government, who exercises authority one over the other, to take from the needy, or to take from people to provide for the needy. And actually he ends up often taking from some of the needy. But he's got his $1 million mansions, and so what does he care? You know, that's amazing. You find a lot of rich people in Hollywood that are all for socialism. I mean, we're talking millionaires. Some of them actually maybe even billionaires. I don't know. They got a lot of money. And they're also for democratic socialism. Now, how much do they give for charity? Do they give half of everything they make in charity? I'll bet you not. But they're all for socialism, you know. Matter of fact, they hire accountants and lawyers to make sure that they don't give too much. You know? But anyway, so we're going to talk about the structure of the kingdom. We started last week in the afternoon show talking about structure. And before that, we talked about Romans 13. And so you really should go back and listen to those shows and get up to speed. But what you should do is join the network, and because then we will send you notices when those things are happening and when you're able to do stuff. But Jesus didn't come to establish the church of God on earth, but the kingdom of God, a government, a form of government. When I say the word government, you know, I say the word church, you think, you know, the building down on the corner. If I say the word government, you think Washington, D.C., the capital of the state, or, you know, senators, congressmen, that sort of thing. But no, the church is a government too, but it's a different form of government. It's separate from the governments of the world, and it is established by Jesus Christ. It is edified by all those who follow the way of Jesus Christ. But that's what the kingdom of God is. It's at hand right now, within your reach. It is a spiritual kingdom within you, but if it's within you, then you should manifest, edify that kingdom in what you're doing. If you're not edifying that kingdom in what you're doing, then you probably have not found it. You're not looking hard enough, because that's what you're supposed to be doing, is seeking the kingdom of God and His righteousness. So, anyway, we've written a lot, and you can go to preparingyou.com. I'll mention these websites so that for the first-time listeners can go, and it's pretty easy to find, and it has a search engine on it. It's got tons and tons of articles. I was going through stuff early this morning before the sun came up, and I was thinking, well, I never wrote anything about this. And I actually did a word search, but I used the Greek, and I didn't find it anywhere. And I thought, geez, didn't I talk about liturgio somewhere on Preparing You? And so then I thought, I might have talked about liturgia, which is another form of the same word in the feminine. And so I looked that up, and sure enough, I did talk about that on the minister's page. And then I thought, I didn't say much about it, and so I thought, maybe I, need to expound on that. So I started expounding on it and adding a little bit more, and then I thought, wait a minute, I didn't look up the word liturgy. Let's look up liturgy. So I did a word search on that. There it is. There's the article on liturgy. Now, I haven't read it. I didn't have time. I had to go out and turn real sheep out in the real wilderness. And good thing I did it when I did. Sun was just barely, I don't even think it was appearing yet, but the sky was lit up. And usually I don't let them out that early because there's coyotes and bobcats and mountain lions out there in the wilderness. But I thought I'd watch them pretty close, and I let them out, and then I went down to where they normally head, and then they didn't come. I go up and I bring them down, and there's a couple of laggers back there that are more interested in filling their bellies than in staying with behind, and you will be left behind. So I had to go, and of course, because they stayed behind, another lamb was following them that wasn't part of that little group, and didn't know where its mother was and kept baying, and that's how I found them. And so then I moved them on down. And hopefully I got them all and moved them down to where the other sheep were, and then tried to move them into a little pen that we put them in. It's a field, a small field, but it's extra fenced. It's fenced within the fence, because the whole place is not fenced. We depend on cliffs and stuff, and the coyotes live in the cliffs, and the bobcats live in the cliffs. So anyway, to give you the picture, eventually I got them down there. But they wanted to run back and forth, and others wanted to run over here, and I remember there was some green grass over here, and I didn't take the dog with me because it has a hurt foot, and so I gave it a day off, and so I'm running. And thinking, why are you guys But it was cool. There were no bugs and green grass everywhere, and they just wanted to fill their bellies, and they had no idea that there's a program scheduled this morning. So anyway, eventually I got a few of them into the little gate, and then they all went down into the little pen, and I locked them up, and so they're hopefully safe out there. But I thought many times of you people out there that are interested in filling your belly or getting your thing done or doing this over here. And just a minute, Jesus, I will come, but first I gotta go bury somebody or do whatever, the whole section about excuses that everybody makes. No, I would really strongly advise against keep making excuses. I think you need to get your act together and start thinking kingdom, because in order to fulfill those first two commandments of loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself, you need to come together to keep an eye on your neighbor, because you've got more than... Do you call all your neighbors every day at the end of the day? Now, just before the program came on, I got an email from somebody evidently in Canada. I don't even know it's a real person. You can't tell by the email. And there was something suspicious about the email. But they said they wanted to be a part of what we're doing. And they're up in apparently Canada. And I didn't recognize the email, and it came to me instead of to the group, so somebody's doing something wrong. And so I said, I just sent the email off to the ministers. I forwarded it on to them and said, does anybody know who this is? And hopefully somebody will try to track them down in Canada and find out what the heck because why don't you know how to be a part of what we're doing this weekend? Evidently, you haven't joined the network yet. You don't know how to use the email. Yeah, everybody can't call me when you need help. You need to call each other because you've got to care about each other. Our ministry is just the reverse of most ministries. And I was thinking about this today as I was rushing back and I actually remember where I was. I was passing through the gate there and looking out in the desert, keeping track of all the little cows out in the desert. And I thought, that most people, they talk about going to church, and the minister doesn't want you going to another church while you're going to his church, because you might end up liking that other pastor better, and then you'll go there, and then he won't be taking care of you anymore, or you won't be taking care of him, however you cut the tithe. But we don't do that. If the Holy Spirit wants you to go to another church, to attend it, go ahead. But don't forget the network. We're not an ear-tickling church. We're not, we do have groups that have some social interaction and that helps them, but a lot of our people are spread out all over, which is a good thing, but it also has its downside because you have to have, local people around you to interact with in order to satisfy the natural inclination, the gregarious inclination to socialize with other people. And so, but we say go ahead, because you may be the only one who brings the Holy Spirit into that church. It may not be the pastor, because he's certainly not doing what Christ's early church was doing. The early church was the entire social welfare. The entire social welfare for all Christians. There was a lot of social welfare around, but that was provided by those men who called themselves benefactors but exercised authority one over the other. Like you guys do out there in the United States and Canada and England and Australia and China and Nicaragua and all those socialist places. So you go to the government for your free bread and for your welfare and for your needs. You don't go to church for that. You go to church to have your ears tickled, your backs patted, saying, oh, you're saved. That's not what the early church was doing. The early church was that social welfare. And we may get into it and talk about it. I mean, like Paul writing to the Romans in chapter 15, I think it is, he's talking about, on my way to Spain, I'm going to stop in and see you guys in Rome. He's going to stop off and see the Romans because he's headed to Spain. Well, back then he probably wasn't taking a jet, so he's going to take some boat that somebody's got oars and a sail on and cross from where he was. I think he probably in Corinth at the time. It's around 54 A.D., because it's the letter of the Romans. And he's headed to Spain. What's he going to do in Spain? Well, of course, he went to Galatia. He's moving large amounts of funds around, because he even talks about it in there, about taking the fruits, that's what he calls the fruits, to the poor saints in Jerusalem. Well, why were the saints so poor in Jerusalem? Well, if you know the history, everybody should be extremely familiar with the history around the gospel in order to be preaching the gospel. There was a famine. Why was there a famine? Well, there was a crop failure. Why was there a crop failure? Well, there were signs in the sun, and but you don't know any of these things. Your pastor doesn't know anything. He doesn't even know what the weightier matters are of law, judgment, mercy, and faith. You see, in order to get to a place where you're actually taking care of one another, you have to be attending to the weightier matters, which is another thing that Christ called out the Pharisees on. So we are on topic here. So they weren't bearing fruit because they weren't attending to the weightier matters. They didn't have a daily ministration operating by faith, hope, and charity. They weren't networking in the tens, hundreds, and thousands anymore. They had become a centralized authoritarian government that taxed the people, put the money in the treasury, and trickled it down to the needy of society. And that was making the Word of God to none effect, because that's the exact opposite of what Christ was saying to do. But guess what, folks? That's what you guys are doing on a daily basis out there. Some people are dissatisfied with that. There's a guy by the name of Goff. I think that was his name. I was trying to remember what his first name is. Trey Goff. You know, like Trey Gowdy, T-R-E-E-Y. And he wrote a new constitution. You know, he's trying to figure out what would a free government be like. Because he's looking out at the government he has today. And, you know, I mean, if little Jimmy Madison was here, he would be turning over in his grave as to what you guys have done. But he predicted, Jefferson predicted, Adams predicted that you would probably do something like what you've done. And they were doing it right out of the box because little Jimmy Madison made a couple of mistakes. He was a pretty smart guy compared to most of the people who would be willing to write a constitution today, but he made a couple of mistakes. And if you know all the history around that period of time, you could start logically pinpointing and saying, oh, you know, they thought this was a good idea. That's not a good idea because they used that bad idea to do this, and then they did this, and then they did this, and then they did this, and then you had the Civil War, and then you had Woodrow Wilson, and then you can follow if you know history, you can follow the progression of your bondage. But if you miss one thing, you've let the camel in the tent. You know, you let his nose in the whole thing. You know what party little Jimmy Madison, that's James Madison. I call him little Jimmy Madison. I actually heard Judge Neapolitano, how did I get that name? Refer to him as that. Because evidently I knew he was really short, but he was actually less than 5 foot. He was like 4'10" or something, which is pretty short. I mean, standing next to George Washington, it must have been quite a mutt and Jeff sight, because Washington was over 6 foot. Well, Washington was a Federalist. Little Jimmy was an anti-Federalist. But what was the name of the party? It was the Democratic Republicans. That's what they called them. Democratic Republicans. You know, that's kind of an oxymoron right there. But that's how you let in. But we're going to look at Trey Goff's Constitution a little bit, and we're going to look at a number of other things and see how they strayed from the kingdom, because they don't even know about the kingdom. But hopefully maybe they'll hear this.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host, Melody Cedarstrom, right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, 1-800-375-4188. 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
So welcome back to Keys of the Kingdom. So what's the constitution of the church? You have constitution of the world, of the United States, of the European Union, all these things. And so anyway, some people in an interview with Trey were asking him, why did you use the word constitution? Because he has his constitution is like a contract that you sign into this group, and then you are subject to that constitution. He thinks that that's going to create a free government, and I'm not. More power to him and his quest. He sees a problem with the loss of freedom in the world today, and so he's trying to find some sort of a remedy, and that's reasonable. To try to find that sort of remedy for the Constitution today, for government today. But you need to know a little bit more about history and how things go wrong, because it's really easy to sit down and plan something out. I remember when I was a kid and I was going to build something, and I planned it out and everything. I didn't draw the pictures or anything, but I planned it out kind of in my head. I wasn't very good at it. I was probably 8 or 9. And I had just a few hand tools that were in the garage and trying to build something, and I didn't know anything about building. And eventually, now, I can design an entire house in my head, but I still draw it out because I know that's part of the deal. Because I know that, this wall's got to actually make it to the corner. It's actually got to meet. Otherwise, you get this big hole there where you thought there was going to be a wall. And so this is kind of the way people go about writing their constitutions today, is that they say, well, this sounds like a good idea, and this sounds like a good idea. And you somebody who actually has done a little bit more study, or maybe more study in a particular area, know a little bit more about history or whatever, they say, yeah, but what happens when this happens? And then they realize, oops, I got to go back to the drawing board. Well, go back to little Jimmy Madison being Democratic Republicans. So they believed, democracy is not mentioned in the Constitution anywhere. And people say, well, the United States is a republic. Well, actually, no, it's not. The United States is a democracy that was created to guarantee a Republican form of government to the states. Almost right out of the box, they were doing things that were going to take away those rights. And we may get to the point where we'll give you some examples of that. But the reality is the states created the Constitution. And the Constitution is not really a contract as it is corporate charter. It's written as if it's a corporate charter. It actually effectively is a corporate charter. But until somebody actually signed on to it, it had no validity whatsoever. The people who signed the Constitution, they didn't create the United States. That's not what created the United States, the Constitution. that, as a matter of fact, the Constitution, if you read we have a whole book online, chapter by chapter. We have recordings with it so that you can get extra explanations, lots of footnotes. And it's, contracts, covenants, and constitutions. Because a constitution it does become a contract. But when they wrote it, it wasn't a contract, it was a corporate charter. But in order for a corporate charter to become a contract, somebody has to agree to become the voting body of the corporation. Somebody has to, if you have a voting body, and in this case they had a voting body, but the voting body was the people in the states would elect somebody to be a congressman, a senator, or whatever in the electoral college, and then they would elect a president. Once they had an agreed president who's agreed to the Constitution, and congressmen and senators that come from those states that had their own congressmen and senators within the states, but these are ones for the federal Congress and federal Senate. Once they all agreed, then by agreeing, they were entering into a contract to go by the corporate charter, the Constitution. People were not a party to that. It was never voted in by the people. It was never voted for by the people, and the people were not a party to the Constitution. This history tells us this. Supreme Court even tells us this. The people were not a party to the Constitution. So when it says "we the people," they're not talking about you originally. They were talking about the people of the United States. Well, who are the people of the United States? There was no United States, so it's not everybody. It's the people who become the senators and congressmen and president and vice president of the United States. Those are the people of the United States. That wasn't the Americans living in each individual state. They weren't a party to the Constitution. So when people say, "we the people," they don't know what they're talking about most of the time. So anyway, it was illegally ratified by the people who did sign at the bottom of the page, and because of the fact that they didn't even actually ratify, shouldn't even use the word ratify, because it was illegally done. It wasn't really ratified by them, because they had no power to create that document. It was just a piece of paper. But they all agreed that this is the piece of paper they came up with. They were only supposed to find out what they could add to the Articles of Confederation that would improve things. Instead, they wrote this whole new agreement. And the Articles of Confederation already said, amongst the states, they couldn't make any changes to the Articles unless it was unanimously done. Well, the Constitution was not unanimously originally. It was not unanimously agreed to by the states. Some states held out, yet they implemented. They got congressmen and senators and presidents, and there they had them. But that was illegal until all the states were in on the deal, and eventually they were, but they actually coerced some of the states to get them to sign. But they have signed, and that's all water under the bridge. But the reality is, had they put it to a popular vote, the people would have voted it down, because they were afraid of the very same thing little Jimmy was afraid of, is overreaching, overpowerful federal government. And there's lots of places where the government got overreaching and overpowered. What the Constitution was doing was giving power to this extra entity that was outside the states to do the things enumerated in the Constitution. If they're not enumerated in the Constitution, they didn't have the power to do it. Now, that doesn't mean they haven't gotten the power since then, but mostly through abdication and sloth of the people, as well as the states, which are just a compilation of the people. But one of the big ways in which they got more power is through the Commerce Clause. And the Commerce Clause, very clearly, was just to regulate exchanges of people from the different states. You have to remember, most of you don't even know, but those of you who have been doing a little bit of homework, the states were separate countries. Just like Mexico is a country, Canada is a country, Maryland was a country, New Jersey was a country, Connecticut was a country, New York was a country. And they had a confederation, Articles of Confederation, but they were still separate countries. When they wrote the Constitution, they were still separate countries. There was not the country of the United States. There was an organization called the United States, a corporation of the United States, created by the states, which relinquished some of their power to the United States, and that the United States could use those powers, but only the powers delegated to them. Well, the Commerce Clause was to limit the power of states to charge other states tariffs and taxes on goods coming into their state from another state. So they were going to limit that so that you couldn't do that, because then the states were freely exchanging between each other. Now, they had the power to impose tariff taxes on stuff coming from outside of the country, but not between the states. Well, that power has greatly expanded, and now the federal government regulates almost everything in the Commerce Clause. And one of the reasons why they did this was because the Supreme Court, which all of a sudden decided that they were the only ones who could interpret the Constitution, and, you could find a lot of people, judges, who think that was incorrect. If the states created the United States, only the states should be allowed to interpret the Constitution. But the states also created the Supreme Court. So within the jurisdiction of the United States, which is very limited, it is reasonable that the federal government determines what the individual meaning of these different things in relationship to the federal government mean, the different things in the Constitution mean. So in that sense, the Supreme Court was right. But at that time, the states could have taken the power of the federal government away from them. And of course, we saw that during the Civil War, that they were taking the power of the federal government away and saying, we're going to be the South. We're going to be, the southern states, confederation of southern states. We're not going to be a part of the federal government. We're going to be part of this other government. And they actually had every right to do that. What they didn't have a right to do was confiscate federal gold and deposit in state banks. They didn't have the right to fire on Fort Sumter, which was a federal fort located within the states. And by doing that, they became the aggressors. And so a lot of Southerners want to refer to the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression. Well, the very first troops that came in there just came in to collect money that Southern merchants owed Northern merchants, because they were confiscating funds and saying, we're not going to pay you in federal dollars, we're going to pay you in some other script. And they didn't really have the right to do that. So that's where they got into trouble. But you go back to the original, the very first part of the U.S. government, the federal government was going out and creating its own bank. And they said that was okay to do that. That they were, I was trying to think of what was the particular phrase that they used. John Marshall was the Supreme Court, and he decided what the Constitution was to mean, not the states, and that was a major mistake. Necessary and proper was the term that we see in the Constitution, necessary and proper. And they interpreted necessary and proper as convenient. And necessary and proper didn't actually mean necessary and proper, because if it should have said absolutely necessary. So they could just now do what was convenient because we decided that it's necessary. But little Jimmy said, no, when I say necessary and proper, I mean necessary and proper. You have to remember he wrote the Constitution. It was his notes that were putting this all together. And so if he says that he actually meant necessary and proper, then they didn't have any right to create a bank. They should have used state banks. And in many cases, they did use state banks. But now we've gone so far away from that. I mean, there's no going back. And this is probably the catch-all. I should get to this so that we can get on to more kingdom-related things. But most people don't know their history, so I have to lay a little groundwork so that you understand. You know, if you read Contracts, Covenants, and Constitution, you'd save me a lot of time. I wouldn't have to explain all these things. But all this is not in there, but this is adding to your knowledge of what was going on. They didn't need to create, and they didn't have the power to create their own bank. And that actually, because that's not enumerated as a power, they shouldn't do it. But they said necessary and proper doesn't really mean necessary and proper. It means convenient and desired, which is an infringement. But the states didn't call them out on it. In the Bible, it tells you what to put into a constitution. You had to put 5 things into a constitution. See, this is where there was a problem with the Constitution. They tried to fix it with the amendments, but they missed the 5 basics of the advice in the Bible as to what to put in a Constitution. If you decide to have somebody who's a chief executive officer, somebody who can exercise authority one over the other, you should put these 5 prohibitions in. One is that he couldn't accumulate gold and silver. He couldn't have his own bank. And they didn't put that prohibition in there. They figured it was kind of in there because we didn't mention it. You know, we didn't say that you could do this, so therefore you can't do it. But then when they did it, nobody called them out on it, at least not enough people. And why did not enough people call them out on it? Because they weren't attending to the weightier matters of law, judgment, mercy, and faith. They were like those sheep this morning. We're running over this hill and running down in this valley because I think there's some green grass over here. They're all trying to fill their own belly or fill their own desires instead of attending to the desires of others. Because in order for a society to be free, you have to care about the freedom of your neighbor as much as you care about yourself. There's a great video, I can't remember the name of the creek where it took place, but it shows water buffalo and lions attacking the water buffalo and crocodiles, and we've got it up on the website. It's all over the internet. But some lions attacked the water buffalo, and they got a calf, and they start pulling the calf down, and the water buffalo all run off. And the calf gets down into the water trying to escape, and then the crocodiles grab the calf. So there's a calf with a crocodile holding it, and there's a lion holding it, and lo and behold, the buffaloes come back in number. Because it's not just the mama comes back, but all the water buffalo come back, and then you start seeing lions flying through the air, and the crocodiles are thwarted, and the calf gets back into the herd, but you still see the water buffalo tossing lions through the air and chasing them off, because even water buffalo care about other water buffaloes as much as they care about themselves. The fact that you don't do that is why you end up in problems. You can't legislate that in a constitution, but the structure of your constitution, at least in your mind, has to leave that responsibility to you to care about your neighbor as much as you care about yourself. You know, like I was thinking just this morning, down in Mexico, South America, Nicaragua, a lot of these places, very socialist, all throughout South America. And I've shared videos on Facebook of people talking about socialism in South America and how it's bad. And that's why the democratic socialists all want people from South America to come up here and give them the right to vote, is because they're going to vote democratic socialists. And you guys sitting there letting them have to do this and letting them teach your kids in school, in your socialist public schools, that socialism is a good thing, you've already lost the vote. You just don't know it yet. Because you didn't take the responsibility of teaching your kids yourself and finding out what they're teaching your kids in school. How many of you parents have read all the books that they use in the public school where you send your kids? You don't even know what they're teaching them. They don't even teach them history anymore at all. So now here I have to spend half the show trying to teach you basic history that you should know. And if you knew it, you wouldn't be voting democratic socialist. You wouldn't be voting for socialism at all, because you'd be real Christians. You can't be a socialist and a Christian. Because a socialist exercises authority one over the other to force the people to take care of the needy of their society. Because they believe in force. They don't believe in charity, which is why you see Bernie Sanders not being a very charitable guy. And, I don't want to pick on poor Bernie. I could probably name you 100, but I just don't know everybody's name. of very rich people that are for socialism. But it's a big mistake. But you need to understand that those responsibilities are yours to teach your children. And you haven't been doing that. And so now your children are growing up and they don't know how wicked socialism is. So anyway, they want to bring all these people up. And I was thinking of a lot of the people in these countries, especially the ones that are a little poor, family's really important. Now, clearly a lot of those families are broken down because, they're literally kidnapping children so that they come across the border with kids, because if they have a kid with them, then they just get a free pass, because you're not allowed to take the kids away from them anymore because you might upset some real parent. But the reality is, this is a manufactured crisis. When the Democrats say that it's a manufactured crisis, they're absolutely right. But they're manufacturing it. It's still a real crisis. It's not a made-up crisis. It's a manufactured crisis. And it's not happening because you don't have a wall. Go ahead and build a wall. If you just got the money that they're cheating on many of the people that are in this country, there's a deal where they can write in, they have a nephew as deductions. They all live in Mexico, but they claim them as deductions. They don't have Social Security numbers, but they claim them as deductions. They get to do that. And they're talking like, this is the IRS figure, is like $4 billion a year is lost in revenue because of this fraudulent claiming of deductions. That could have built the wall. In the last 10 years, you could have built 10 walls. But the answer isn't the wall. The answer is the kingdom. But if you're not going to seek the kingdom, go ahead and build your wall. That's up to you guys. That's the other government. But what you need to be doing is seeking the kingdom. And this Constitution of Trey Goff is missing it. And maybe he'd like to know where he's missing it, and that's hopefully what we're going to be looking at. It's going to take more than this show to go through it. But you need some groundwork to understand that any responsibility, and this is one of the things we're going to point out several places, any responsibility that belongs to the people that you try to get the government to take care of is a camel's nose in the tent. You have to take your responsibilities back in every aspect of society. So, like I was saying, down in South America, a lot of these places, families are really important. And even sometimes the village. My family's important. My village is important. But the next village, they're on their own. And that's tribalism. The bad part of tribalism. The good part of tribalism, you know, when the 11 tribes of Israel, there's 12, I know, but one was the Levites. But the 11 tribes of Israel, who all owned land in different places, they settled in different places. And now the tribe didn't own the land. The people own the land. And we're going to get into that. Very important. The people own the land, not the government. The people own the land. The people own the law. And the law has to be written in their hearts. The people are responsibility to attend to the weightier matters of law, judgment, mercy, and faith, not just for themselves, but for others. This is the flock. The sheep have to learn to stick together, or they're going to be devoured one at a time. So they had their tribal areas. Reuben was kind of far off, the tribe of Reuben. And because they were so far off, they started building their own little temple, the tabernacle. And the other tribes thought, like, what are they doing? How are they doing? Why are they doing this? They went to ask them, why are you building a temple, a tabernacle over here? And they came with swords at their side. And they asked them, why are you building this here? And they said, oh, don't get us wrong. The doors of our tabernacle face the tabernacle of Israel. Now, these are metaphors. But we're so far away, we thought we'd build our own tabernacle. Now, was it a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. You have to remember the tabernacle, the capital of Israel, which was this tent, moved every year, was in a different location. It was in a different tribal area. This is to prevent tribalism, competition. If you're going to build a capital, it's going to be where? It's going to be in this particular place. You don't want that. Because now you're centralizing responsibility. No, you want it moving around. Even the high priest, he would be from one tribe 1 year, you know, a Levite from one tribe 1 year, because Levites were in all these areas. They didn't own any land in their own name. There was Levite land set aside in all these areas. So this is a way of getting away from the tribalism. So anyway, that's one of the problems. That's why the socialism doesn't work coming out of South America, is because of the fact family's important, my community is important, but the next community, they're on their own.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.